Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on this episode is Dave Domina. Dave is an attorney in Omaha, Nebraska, and he represents the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska in one of what has become a wave of national lawsuits against the pharmaceutical industry for its role in the opioid epidemic. We've all heard about the scourge of opioid addiction in this country, and the role of the pharmaceutical industry in making, distributing, and dispensing these drugs, and really, as Dave argues, lying about the addictive qualities of these drugs, is something you're not going to want to miss. And as well, I will say, the fascinating story of the Ponca tribe and the role of their people in the history of Native Americans in this country, and that is our history as a country too, is something that's an important part of this particular story. So a fascinating episode on a national story, but from a very especially interesting and powerful local angle. You won't want to miss this episode. A fascinating conversation with Dave Domina. Thanks. Oh, and one more thing. I am featured on the cover of Attorney at Law Philadelphia magazine, the premier issue of this new magazine, and it's a profile on me and our firm and all of our background here. So if that's something you're interested in, check out the link below. Thanks again. My guest today is Dave Domina. Dave is an attorney in Nebraska. First of all, Dave, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Well, thank you very much.
We're going to be talking today about an important topic, to say the least, something that is has received national attention recently, and I think people generally are familiar with the problem we face as a country in the opioid epidemic we're facing, prescription drugs for pain that have been become such a pervasive problem throughout the country. And Dave, you have filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of the Ponca tribe in Nebraska, joining dozens and dozens of other similar lawsuits against opioid manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies. So I want to get into the subject of the opioid epidemic, what your case and the others that have been filed are looking to try to accomplish, and where we see this going. But before we dive into that really important topic, could you give us a bit of background on yourself, Dave? You've had a fascinating career in Nebraska. I'd love it if you just give us a bit of background on yourself.
Well, I describe myself generally as a corn and cattle lawyer, and say with a smile that in Nebraska you've got to sue people over corn and cattle because we don't have a lot of people. Nebraska was admitted to the state to the United States just after the Civil War, of course. And at that time, the Transcontinental Railroad was being built. There was a lot of optimism that the state would be populated like Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. But our topsoil is a little thinner, so our practice of law is, as a consequence, even today, a little different. And it involves large tracts of agriculture. We produce more cattle than any place else in the United States, any other state. About 40% of the state's population is swarmed up around the city of Omaha on the eastern side, so we've got a lot of expanse. In that expanse are 4 federally recognized tribes of Native American people: the Poncas, the Winnebagos, the Omahas, and the Santee Sioux. And I have the honor of representing all of them in this opioids litigation.
And your career as a trial lawyer in Nebraska, you've handled a number of agricultural-based cases. In looking at your bio, I know that you have the distinction of winning a verdict against one of the big meat packing companies that later became part of Tyson Foods. It was a $1.28 billion verdict on behalf of cattle producers. So your practice, based in Nebraska, you've handled big cases like that in the agricultural field, but also in other areas as well. Is that right?
Yes, I suppose if I have any uniqueness, I can claim this. I might be the only lawyer in the country who has successfully defended capital cases and has also prosecuted public officials through the impeachment process and had them impeached. And I've done that twice. In our state, we have a one-house legislature, a unicameral. So when an official is impeached here, the state Supreme Court sits as a jury and decides it. And in my lifetime, we've had two of those, and I was fortunate to be selected by the legislature to try them both. Our first one was in 1867, and I missed it.
But 35 years in practice, and Dave, you've also dabbled in politics, if I could call it that. You ran for governor of Nebraska in the 80s, and just a couple of years ago ran for the U.S. Senate from Nebraska as well.
That's true. We're a deep red state, and sometimes running in the other party is more of a service than a candidacy, but I have run twice.
Well, good. So tell us now the story about the Ponca tribe and your representation of them in this. We're going to talk a lot about the opioid epidemic and what your case, the issues that are raised in your case. A 139-page complaint that was filed just a few weeks ago. I've written a lot of complaints in my 20+ years, but this is a book on the opioid crisis that we're facing. You tell in the very beginning part of this complaint a fascinating story about the Ponca tribe. That's an important part of our country's history. I wonder if you could tell that story, and from that, how you got into a relationship with this tribe and to take on this important issue.
It's always an honor to tell the story of Chief Standing Bear. Chief Standing Bear of the Ponca tribe was forcibly relocated from the ancestral home of the Ponca people in Nebraska to Oklahoma, and that meant walking there by forced march. His son became ill during the walk to Oklahoma, died shortly afterwards, probably of pneumonia, and as he was dying, he asked his father to take him home to Nebraska to bury him. So Standing Bear and two other adult men started out pulling a trellis by hand and pulling the body of this deceased teenage child from south central Oklahoma to northeast Nebraska. They were stopped by the United States Cavalry about 90 miles northwest of what is currently Omaha in Nebraska. They were arrested. The commanding general at Fort Omaha thought that it was terrible that he had to arrest Standing Bear because he knew his mission of mercy. He knew that Standing Bear and the Ponca had always been peaceful people, had never been at war with the United States, and had caused no trouble in Nebraska. So he, the general, asked the lawyers who represented the Union Pacific Railroad in Omaha, they were certainly the leading lawyers in the city and state at that time, to volunteer to represent Standing Bear and sue the general for a writ of habeas corpus. That meant the court had to decide whether Standing Bear was a human being or a savage. And that was the legal question presented.
Incredible.
That was 14 years after the end of the Civil War. And until that time, we had never counted a Native American in a census because under federal law, they were savages and not human beings. The federal judge recognized Standing Bear as a human being, declared that he had status and was entitled to a writ of habeas corpus, and in the same opinion, the United States District Judge in newly admitted Nebraska issued an injunction enjoining the President of the United States and the United States military against relocating any more Native Americans.
Wow.
And it stopped. The President did not appeal that order.
That's incredible. So this was in 1879, and I mean, these marches, the marches of Native Americans on foot is reminiscent of other points in history when that happened. And it's really startling to focus on this fact of our history and understand that this is a part of our history, a terrible part of our history. And now you represent the Ponca tribe. How did that come about? How did you come to be acquainted with them, and how did you come to take on this case on their behalf?
I grew up on a dairy farm in northeast Nebraska between the four reservations. So I knew Native American children, played sports with them, had them as friends, and they me. So I have a long time history of acquaintance with really people from all four tribes, which I've cherished all my life. I've occasionally been able to serve them as a lawyer, and maybe some of the earlier comments suggest that I sort of get invited out here on the prairie to take on some unusual cases. So from time to time, they've asked me to do that. I've helped them oppose the TransCanada Keystone XL pipeline for 9 years. We are the only jurisdiction that still prevents its construction in the United States. There's a lawsuit in Montana now that's attempting to back up Nebraska, but we have that project tied up here. And all four of the tribes, including certainly the Ponca, have been very supportive and have worked very closely with me and me with them about that. I also had an opportunity about a year and a half ago to close down an exploitive liquor sales establishment just into Nebraska across the South Dakota border that had been exploiting two Native American tribes, not the Poncas up there, but the Poncas have always been very compassionate people, were very intensively involved in supporting that effort. And it was probably closing down those liquor sales that led all four of these tribes to decide that they wanted me to help with this opioids issue.
So let's get into that then. And the wave of lawsuits that we've seen filed in the last number of months on behalf of cities, municipalities, states, against a long list of makers of prescription drugs, prescription painkillers like OxyContin and Percocet and other opioid medications, now joined by your case on behalf of the Ponca people. What is the predicate for these cases and yours as well? What is the main thrust of this litigation?
I think this is the core. For many years, federal law has required that manufacturers of prescription medications must have a method for tracking them to make certain that they reach responsible dispensers at registered and licensed pharmacies and are prescribed by licensed physicians and then are placed in the hands only of the patients for whom they are prescribed. The federal law's theory, by design, is something like balancing the books of the nation's banks every day. Every bank has to balance its cash and its accounts. Then it goes upstream to its local Federal Reserve, to the regional Federal Reserve, until finally each day the computers of the country balance all of the accounts in all of the banks in all of the United States. Well, in theory, that's the way prescription drugs are supposed to work. The difference is that the Federal Reserve System is operated by the United States, and this medicine accounting for system is only overseen by regulatory officials at the state and federal levels. It's supposed to be activated by the drug companies. There was a massive failure, almost universal, to both manufacturers and distributors to adhere to those responsibilities and balance the books. That aided and abetted in the dramatic maldistribution of opioid medications. So you have examples like a little town of 1,000 people in West Virginia that had, 33 million or something like that doses in a single year reach dispensaries there. That's probably the single core element, simply not paying attention to the distribution chain.
So, and this is called diversion, right? This is
Yes, it is.
Okay. So, but we know that there's also been, and the history of this is traced in this lengthy civil complaint that you filed in federal court in Nebraska. We know that there's been an evolution in the way these opioid drugs have been prescribed, the way they've been marketed, distributed, sold, dispensed, starting with the use of these drugs for very limited medical purposes, right? For end of life care and for cancer patients primarily, but that's no longer the case. And we've seen over the last 20 years or so an epidemic in the prescribing of these drugs and the use of these drugs and the addiction to these drugs. You talk about that a little bit and how that figures into now this federal lawsuit you've brought.
There are three key words here: acute pain, chronic pain, and key opinion leaders. These medications were intended to be used for acute pain. That is, pain that is so situationally severe that it requires an extreme medication to give relief. Post-surgical pain, end-of-life cancer pain would be episodes involving what would be called acute pain and be appropriate for these drugs. Chronic pain, of course, is terrible for the patient. The patient has it on a persistent long-term basis, is extremely uncomfortable, and I mean in pain. Severe pain, the patient probably would rate it as acute, but it isn't going to go away with the healing process or end on a relatively short-term basis with death. It's simply going to remain with that patient because of a medical condition he or she has. In some situations, some relief from that kind of pain can be properly prescribed if the doctor does it in a way that is certain and careful with monitoring to avoid addictions that produce other problems. Now, we get to key opinion leaders. We know the difference between acute and chronic pain. The drug companies not only are accused, but they have admitted in settlements with the Attorney General of New York and in settlements reached with agencies of the United States that have resulted in huge fines, that they essentially seduced many, many, many doctors across the United States with large payments and fancy vacations and an agreement that in exchange the doctors would accept their non-researched clinical observations, they were called, and repeat them as their own experiences in order to persuade other doctors that these medications do not pose a significant risk of addiction.
So these are doctors holding themselves out as experts, but really
Yes.
they're paid consultants for the drug company. I mean, to put it bluntly.
That's exactly right. They may very well have been practicing in orthopedic surgery or someplace else where they would deal with pain, neurology, whatever it may have been, but they didn't have the clinical experience they were repeating. They were just, frankly, paid mouthpieces. Enough of them did that. In 1 year, the drug industry confesses having spent $880 million in payments to key opinion leaders in order to change the standard of care, to convince the medical community that there was a minimal risk of addiction and that if there were addictive symptoms displayed, the patient could be readily relieved of those when those things just weren't true.
And as a result... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
Well, no, I was going to say, and also part of when you speak of changing the standard of care, I mean, you know, for us lawyers who try cases in this area, you know, the standard of care is what's appropriate in the circumstances, and so to change the standard of care in this context means to convince the medical community and also the regulatory agencies that these drugs are appropriate not only for acute pain cases, as you were saying, but also for the much, much more vast area of chronic pain situations. And to do that, they have to also be convincing that these drugs are not addicting or not as addicting as we know they are. And that seems
Those
to be a
things,
huge part of it.
it is a huge part of it, and it's a huge part of what there have been admissions of wrongdoing for. But can I give an example?
Yeah.
One company, Johnson and Johnson, has paid what at least appears to me by my own calculation, footnoted in that complaint you've read, a little over $3 billion in fines over the years for its methods of marketing drugs. A big part of its financial loss in those fine situations was over an antipsychotic drug called Risperdal.
Mm-hmm.
The methods it was using for the sale of Risperdal, for which it was fined huge sums of money, appear to be identical to the methods it uses and used to sell opioids in an overlapping time period. So even as it was paying those huge fines, admitting it was doing the wrong thing, it was making so much money on the opioids that it appears to have treated this as a cost of doing business.
Well, and it's perfect timing because I actually had that page of the complaint open. And I was just about to ask you about that. It's on page 52 of the complaint. And we'll post a link to it if that's all right with you. It's a public document, and that way,
Sure.
people who listen can read. And when I say this is a treatise, the complaint really is so much of what anybody needs to know and understand about the scope and scale of this crisis. And I have always marveled at this when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, that they can pay hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, not because they're doing good, and they may be doing good in lots of ways, but because they're violating the law. These are settlements with the government, state and federal, and to absorb hundreds of millions of dollars in fines tells you how much money they're making on the sale of these drugs. And you quote those figures as well, that for instance, I think it's OxyContin, which is made by a company called Purdue. OxyContin, you cite in the complaint, constitutes 30% of the entire market for painkillers, just that one drug. And annual sales to Purdue from the sale of OxyContin fluctuate between 2.5 and $3 billion a year. This is a huge, huge, huge market, which speaks to the extent of the use and also what we know, the highly addicting nature of these drugs.
It absolutely does, and it should go without saying, I suppose, but let's say it. These are Schedule II controlled substances. These are illegal drugs to have on the street. They can only be manufactured by licensed manufacturers, distributed by licensed distributors, dispensed by licensed pharmacists, prescribed by licensed doctors, and possessed by patients with prescriptions. They are dangerous, and that's why they're scheduled.
So Dave, because you represent the Ponca tribe in this litigation, other cases that make similar allegations, describing the crisis in similar ways, targeting a similar group of defendants, the makers, distributors, dispensers of these drugs. But your focus in this is the Ponca tribe. So I think it's a great opportunity to understand the impact of this crisis. If we could look at one population in particular, speak a little bit about what the impact has been on the Ponca tribe, because we're going to talk about these people, but we could be talking about the people of Philadelphia, where I'm sitting right now, or the citizens of Omaha, where you are. But it'll help people understand, I think, the scope of this, to focus on a specific group of people. So, since that's the focus of your case, talk a little bit about the impact on the Ponca tribe.
Well, let me start by saying there are approximately 570 federally recognized tribes across the United States, including Alaska, and the Ponca tribe is one of them. Most of those tribes have reservations. Some have what are called service areas. So they're geographically defined.
Mm-hmm.
And on those locations, those geographically defined locations or reservations, the primary source of health care is the Indian Health Service. On many of the reservations, particularly in the Plains states, the tribes are poor and their populations are poor. It's not true of the Poncas. They're in a better situation. But
Mm-hmm.
some of my other Plains tribes have unemployment rates on their reservations as high as, listen carefully now, 80%
Incredible.
of the workforce. And that is a chronic problem. And most of the employment that does exist, the 20%, is positions of employment with the tribal government itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the Poncas aren't quite that acute, but just imagine those sorts of problems, a poor population, heavy demand on the healthcare service, pressure on the providers to see the patients and get them in and out, a very long history of addiction problems, and much science that suggests that the Native American is in fact more vulnerable to addictions than are others in the population in general. That is a physiological circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
It's true of alcohol. It's true of other addictive features. So oftentimes in the Native community, this will start with an opioid prescription for an injury that is secondary to intoxication or secondary to domestic violence that is also associated with alcohol or some other addiction. And so it becomes something that just multiplies by an exponent from household after household and family after family. And it begets more addictions because the injured person also goes to the IHS, also has pain, and because of what the defendants had done to persuade providers that it was safe, often got an opioid prescription.
Mm-hmm.
And so very, very quickly, these confined populations have rampant secondary addictions to opioids that are problems that are as insurmountable as any historical addiction problem they had, but more widespread. So they actually threaten the continuity of some of the small tribes. That is a legitimate epidemiological concern that some of the smallest of our tribes could not survive this addiction if it isn't turned back.
Well, and of course, at one extreme in terms of impact of addiction, and this isn't telling a secret. This is telling a widely known fact that many people who start out becoming addicted to a prescription drug like OxyContin, for instance, may go on to use other drugs, other addicting drugs like heroin, which, by the way, comes from the same source ultimately as these opioid prescription drugs, and they can get heroin a lot more cheaply in many cases. So you get involved. You may start with a legal drug and end up involved with illegal drugs like heroin, very dangerous drugs like heroin. You talk in the complaint about some of the health impacts of this. For instance, the impact on children who are born to mothers who are addicted. What are some of the other health impacts? Obviously, death is the ultimate health impact, and many do die from opioid use and addiction. But what are some of the other health impacts that you're aware of?
Well, with mothers who are prescribed opioids, sometimes innocently for back pain or whatever it may be during pregnancy, by physicians who were persuaded by the healthcare providers that this stuff was safe because of the false literature they published, etc. The baby is born addicted, and the withdrawal of that little bitty baby is a very, very difficult medical situation. It almost always is believed to produce a lifelong adverse impact. People know about fetal alcohol syndrome. This is called neonatal abstinence syndrome. There aren't enough longitudinal studies yet to know if the lifelong effects will be like fetal alcohol syndrome, but if they are, that is a massive devastation. Let me tell you that in the Plains tribes, a fetal alcohol baby likely costs the taxpayers of the United States approximately $5 million, $1 million a year, for the first 5 years of life.
Wow.
Just to get that baby to survive. And so the NAS babies, it is feared and appears as though those numbers will be somewhat similar. And, this just didn't have to happen. As for other issues and areas where death doesn't occur, of course, you have disability from any opportunity for gainful employment. You have a proliferation of the kinds of behaviors that go with addictions in homes. Women are beaten. Native American women are 10 times as likely to be murdered as women in the general population in the United States. So the health issues are often mental health issues. They are criminality and all of the things that go with criminality, and the whole array. The life expectancy in the Plains tribes is often under 50 years. One of the South Dakota tribes has the lowest life expectancy in North America, including Haiti. And these opioids are a part of that problem.
Well, we've talked about these huge companies, Purdue, Johnson & Johnson, other companies that distribute opioids like AmerisourceBergen, a company from Pennsylvania where I am, pharmacies like Walgreens and others that dispense these drugs. These the companies that are involved are some of the largest companies in the pharmaceutical sector. And yeah, they make a lot of money. And one could argue, well, okay, we live in a capitalist society. We have an economy. These are companies that have a right to make a profit from things they sell, including drugs, if that's what your business is. So what's wrong with companies like the ones involved in your case who are making a lot of money in this business? That doesn't in and of itself mean that they've done anything wrong. So what is it that in a nutshell these companies have done wrong, as you're alleging, and others are too in these cases?
Well, these companies have consciously and deliberately published and encouraged the belief based on their publications that these drugs are safe for use for patients with acute pain, and that they are accounted for and not diverted, and that any addictions they engender are shallow and easily treated, and therefore there is little or no likelihood that they will lead to either theft or other crimes of diversion, or to extensions to illegal drugs like heroin and fentanyl. Those have been their marketing tools. Those have been the things they've said, done, and repeated. They sold them to the FDA and got drug approval as a result of doing that, and kept it as a result of doing that, and now face losing it as a result of having lied about those things. The other problem here is that these companies have done this repeatedly, not only with this drug, which has produced a crisis so severe that the United Nations has announced an initiative to try to confine the opioid crisis to North America. I want the American people to think about that for a little bit. We're accustomed to hearing about trying to keep the Asian flu virus or Ebola in some other part of the world. This is a crisis that the world is trying to keep confined to our country. It's that bad. And it's the product of capitalism unchecked. When the incentive to make money is more important than the incentive to tell the truth, the incentive to be honest with people, to give them a chance to live, which is what medications are supposed to do, instead of being at risk to die because they get addicted to them. It's well beyond the time when capitalism requires an aggressive regulator.
What about the doctors? Because ultimately, a patient's first exposure to these drugs is going to come courtesy of a prescription from a doctor. Is it your assessment of the problem here that even most of the physicians who prescribe these drugs have been lied to, which is essentially what you're alleging in the case, that the physicians themselves have also been lied to by the companies making and distributing these drugs?
The overwhelming majority of physicians intended no wrong. And today, as they look at patients and have to decide today, shall I prescribe this medication, are making high quality decisions and are even more careful because of what's happened, of course, than they were before, and they know what they were told before was false. The doctors who took the money and lied, there's no excuse for that, and there's no justification for their behavior. They deserve their special little place in hell along with the manufacturers and distributors. But that's a distinct minority, and they are being found out one by one.
Let's talk a little bit about the strategy here. You do have regulatory agencies that are supposed to be exercising some degree of supervision over this industry, the FDA. But as you point out in the complaint that you filed, and no surprise here, some of the money that the big drug companies are spending is on lobbying the very regulatory officials who are supposed to be, minding what's going on in this industry. You cite, one company that gave, I think, it was almost $25,000 to the FDA commissioner, and no surprise, they spent a lot of money on lobbying and maybe things that are a little more crude than actual lobbying itself. But what this reminds me of, the case that you filed and the dozens of others that have been filed across the country, is the fairly recent experience we had with the tobacco litigation. Do you see a parallel here in how you're looking to address this issue on behalf of your client with the experience that we had in this country involving the big tobacco companies?
Well, the parallels are in two parts, but there are many dissimilarities. The two parallels are essentially that the tobacco companies included in their product an addictive ingredient that they didn't disclose, and then they lied about it, including their senior executives lying about it. But they never sold tobacco, or at least in the last 50 years, never sold tobacco as something that was good for you, that was supposed to make you well when you were ill. These pharmaceutical companies are selling something that they manufacture and present to physicians and the public as instrumentalities of wellness. They're supposed to improve life, make people feel better physically and be well so they can be productive, when they were in fact able to build these products and distribute them at a margin level so massive that they wanted to sell more and more and more to people who didn't need them, but who got a high out of them, and they went off the rails. So that's the dissimilarity. The people who smoked as teenagers were probably attracted to that for the reasons teenagers are attracted to trying to be adults. But the people who took these pills got them from doctors who overwhelmingly thought they were giving their patients something that would make them better. It would be a very rare doctor, thank goodness, who would prescribe opioids to a pregnant woman, knowing that there was a probability that her little fetus in her body was going to be born as a baby addicted to something that would hurt it from birth on. I just don't think that's what Americans' physicians are about. That's what America's pharmaceutical companies have been about.
But and I hear what you're saying, but in terms of what you're doing about it and what the Ponca tribe is doing about it, and you quote very eloquently in the complaint, relating back to the story of Chief Standing Bear, who stood up and said, I am somebody, I'm a man, and take notice of that, the impact that act has had on the Native American people in this country. And now the Ponca tribe, as you point out, is doing that here. They're standing up and saying, we have to do something about this. Doing it in the form of a litigation, in the form of this case that's been filed, as a strategy also to bring about change. There does seem to be that parallel in the ways in which the tobacco companies were brought to a certain kind of justice through litigation, through the courts.
Well, we want two different remedies here, and the first one, of course, is a financial remedy for the Ponca tribe, and the second is an injunction to make certain that going forward, these particular Schedule II drugs, which are the only ones in our lawsuit, the opioids drugs, are manufactured only by responsible people, distributed only by responsible people, at margins that are reasonable and are not diverted, and that physicians are told the truth about how they can be used safely so patients use them safely. In a nutshell, what we want is the court to make certain that the off-the-rails regulatory system of the FDA is reinforced by the strength of the federal judiciary. And I'm absolutely certain that the judge responsible for this litigation appreciates that this task has fallen to the judiciary because, as he has said in open court, the administration and the Congress have failed the American people. So it falls to the judiciary to provide a solution to this crisis.
Now, the judge you're speaking of, you filed your case in federal court in Nebraska, but this case and the other cases around the country that have been filed in various federal courts are all going to be consolidated in front of one judge, and that's the judge in Ohio. Is that right?
Yes, and the Ponca's case has also been transferred there for discovery purposes. Mm-hmm. It could be returned to Nebraska for trial, of course, and we anticipate that's probably what will happen if the Ponca case is one of those that is tried, and that remains to be seen. But we're optimistic that it will be, and that it will be tried here at home.
Gotcha. Dave, this is as I said, a really important issue. I think it's a fascinating story, and I don't think that many people would think this is true, but I'm telling everybody who's listening that it is. If you read this complaint, you're going to learn a lot about this issue, and the history of the problem, the history of the Ponca people, and the terrible impact that the opioid crisis has had on the Ponca people, but also on communities all across the country. So we will post a link to this complaint so people can read it for themselves. And I want to thank you so much for explaining what's been happening and giving us the background we need to understand what's happening with your case and with this issue broadly. So it's been a pleasure and a privilege to have you on the program, Dave, and I want to thank you again very much.
Well, thank you for your kindness to the Ponca people.